The United States has a $1 trillion problem, an addiction to debt which is growing by the day. Its debt has grown by over 800% since 1990, accelerating its unfavourable title of having the largest debt by value in the world. But does it really matter? Well, this depends on who you ask. Ultimately, its addiction to debt is a consequence of tax cuts, an ageing population, and how cheap it has become to borrow ever larger sums. Though to truly explain this, I need to tell you a story of how the richest nation on earth has also become the most indebted, alongside what they could do about it. In order to do this, we'll be addressing when the debt started to explode, the main reasons behind it, some sobering projections for the future, and why some believe it may not actually matter. If this sounds like something you'd enjoy watching, please consider hitting that subscribe button and notification bell. So how did we get here? In the aftermath of the Second World War, the US debt stood at over 100% of GDP. Yet unlike recent years, this was due to a short-term shock and quickly fell. Throughout its post-war history, the US's debt has gone through periods of faster and slower growth. During the late 90s and early 2000s, the debt had actually fallen to as little as 55% of GDP, a time when the government even managed to deliver a budget surplus. However, the days of budget surpluses are long gone. Since the turn of the millennium, the debt has climbed, slowly at first, and then rapidly. Like any large macroeconomic event, this rising debt wasn't the result of one, but several factors. A consequence of costly foreign interventions, the Great Recession, and an aging population, which has all culminated in a debt equivalent to over $80,000 per citizen. But before we go any further, there is a common misconception a lot of people make about US debt, which is how the figure is actually accounted for. In reality, there are two main categories of US public debt: the debt which is owed to intra-government agencies, and the debt which is publicly held. The difference between the two is crucial to understand. The intra-governmental debt is the money held by government trust funds, revolving funds, or special funds. You may be wondering why the government owes money to itself. And well, this is because some government agencies make more money through revenues than they spend. And like any responsible investor, they invest this surplus cash, lending it back to the government by law. On the other hand, the publicly held debt is all the debt held by local and foreign governments, corporations, or even individuals like you and I. Between the two groups, the public hold by far the largest percentage, equivalent to roughly 3/4 or $21 trillion. And this is where the surge in debt has come from in recent years, and is in fact responsible for the growth in debt in 2020, whilst the intra-government debt has remained pretty flat. So, with that established, what are the main causes of the US debt binge? At its simplest, the US's ballooning debt pile is the result of an accumulation of consistent federal budget deficits. These deficits have gotten so large that in recent years they have given rise to the idea of the persistent $1 trillion deficit. An unthinkable term before 2008, the deficit in 2019, a year of economic growth by the way, was nearly $1 trillion and is expected to triple in 2020 alone. But the debt is more than just the deficit, it's the reasons behind it. To truly understand US debt, you have to look at the US budget. Contrary to popular belief, the largest proportion of federal spending isn't defense, but mandatory spending, which makes up more than half of the budget, the largest chunk of which goes on entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. You see, the US's aging population is taking up an ever-increasing amount of its mandatory spending. As the baby boomer generation swaps the workplace for retirement, the ratio of those paying into state coffers to those receiving benefits will continue to decline. This is no better highlighted than the nation's Social Security trust funds, which are basically America's retirement funds. These funds raise money from payroll taxes, which are used to pay out expenditures each month. Whilst these funds have consistently delivered surpluses since the 80s, this surplus has collapsed in recent years due to rising payments and sluggish wage growth. According to Congress, these funds will be depleted by 2030 based on current policies. Now, when it comes to discretionary spending, by far the biggest item is defence, the second largest item of expenditure overall and accounting for half of all discretionary spending. Unsurprisingly, being the world's #1 military superpower isn't cheap, with defence spending nearing $700 billion in 2019, which was more than the next 7 largest militaries combined. Though spending is only half of the equation, the other is revenue. A contentious but big contributor of US debt over the years has been the tax cuts of multiple presidents. Whether we talk about the Bush tax cuts of the early 2000s or the plainly stated Tax Cuts and Jobs Act President Trump passed in 2017. You see, the idea behind them is that reducing tax stimulates GDP, increasing tax revenue as a result. The 2017 tax cuts, for example, were expected to boost GDP by 1% a year over the next decade, but also increase annual budget shortfalls over the same period. But all this begs the question, if the US is racking up such huge debts, who is lending the nation all this money? As mentioned earlier in the video, the publicly held debt is where the supply of new debt has come from in recent years. Contrary to popular opinion, roughly 70% of this debt is owned domestically, with the Federal Reserve being the largest single contributor, followed by pension funds. The remaining third is held by foreign countries, with Japan and China the 2 largest holders, both holding over $1 trillion. But why do these countries hold such a large proportion? Well, that's because they're both heavily reliant on exports. You see, by buying dollar-denominated US debt, they help maintain demand for the US dollar and therefore make the dollar more expensive relative to their own currencies. Demand which is backed up by the US's position as the world's reserve currency and a safe haven in times of uncertainty, which further incentivizes foreign powers to hold the dollar for international trade. Such high demand for the dollar allows the US government to borrow money at lower interest rates, effectively incentivizing further debt through access to very cheap credit. However, there are concerns that interest payments as a proportion of US spending will increase considerably as rates return to more typical levels at some point in the future. So given all of this, what are the projections for the future? If you thought the US's current debt problems were bad, the future projections are truly sobering. The US Treasury has stated that on current policies, the US debt is set to rise to a staggering 475% of GDP over the next 75 years. Even before the financial disaster of 2020, publicly held debt was set to rise to $29 trillion over the next decade. The main cause of this, mandatory spending programs, which are set to rise as an aging population leads to greater expenditure on retirement payments and rising healthcare expenses, which are already amongst the highest in the world. Meanwhile, as already alluded to, the large debts the US has already racked up are expected to create ever greater interest payments, with analysts predicting the US is on track to spend at least $4.2 trillion in interest payments over the next decade. And that's even with historically low interest rates. So what could the US do to solve this debt problem? Since 1917, the US has had a simple system to manage its growing pile of debt: the debt ceiling. This caps the maximum amount of money the US government can borrow by law. When the ceiling is reached, the US has to find other ways to pay for its debts. The trouble is, the ceiling is movable, and always in one direction, upwards. Since its creation, it's been increased over 100 times, 10 times since 2008 alone, alongside multiple suspensions. In fact, since 2019, the ceiling has been suspended for the next 2 years, which makes the ceiling more of an escalator. Besides a physical cap, the most direct thing the US could do is cut spending. However, this creates a bit of a problem. To bring the US deficit under control, the US would have to cut spending so severely it would slow economic growth and may actually push the debt as a percentage of GDP higher, by creating a negative multiplier effect. Alternatively, the government could reverse its previous tax cuts to raise more revenue, though additional taxes can only go so far before they become counterproductive. This is something outlined by the Laffer Curve, which states there is an optimal rate of taxation before it acts as a disincentive to work. A more novel solution would be to grow the GDP at a faster rate than the debt, thereby reducing the debt to GDP ratio. Unfortunately, Congress doesn't agree on the best way to do this, with Democrats favouring increased spending and Republicans tax cuts, both of which run the risk of raising the national debt relative to GDP. Despite these concerns and challenges over reducing the debt, many economists believe the US debt isn't really an issue, or at least not yet. Why the US debt may not be a big deal. Firstly, the US economy has historically outpaced its debt, so as a percentage of GDP, the debt has not grown exponentially. Even if the debt, as large as it is today, was frozen, the expectation is that it would fall to a reasonable percentage of GDP pretty quickly. However, the US now finds itself in a different position to the past, one of an aging population and sluggish income growth, which makes a robust recovery and long-term high growth less certain. But as alluded to earlier, the US is currently enjoying very low interest rates, which are expected to continue into the foreseeable future. This makes the cost of debt cheaper than many would believe, and has led to claims of commentators suffering from deficit attention disorder, focusing too much on deficits based on cheap credit, at least until rates rise. And finally, cynics say that Congress has a lot to lose if they were to ever get serious about cutting spending. With entitlement programs making up an ever-increasing share of spending, it would be politically unpopular to address the issue and much easier to just raise the debt ceiling. So overall, we've seen that the debt has risen sharply since the early 2000s. Large budget deficits have become the new normal. There is no one main cause, though one factor which stands above the rest is the US's aging population, as well as sluggish income growth to pay for the rising bills of entitlement programs. America's position as the reserve currency of the world has kept demand for the dollar high and interest rates low, incentivizing cheap borrowing. If the US were ever to get serious about its debt, there are no easy options, with deep spending cuts and tax rises most likely. However, commentators have pointed out that in the long run, US GDP growth has kept its debt ratio under control, with the cost of debt cheap at the moment. Whether the US is changing demographics and the risk of higher interest rates in the future change that opinion remains to be seen. Now, we want to hear what your thoughts are. Do you think the US's growing debt pile is manageable? Will it bounce back in the years to come? Or will it be responsible for the next financial crisis? Let us know in the comments below. The Alt Simplified team hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It really helps grow this channel. As always, see you in the next video.